right. So we are live on Facebook. Thank you everybody for joining us for our part 9 of our anti-hate conversation series. I'm really excited for today's session, but before we begin, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. The work of the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians takes place on traditional Indigenous territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, Takaranto, the traditional Mohawk name of this area called Toronto, meaning a gathering place, and its surrounding areas are still home to Indigenous people, and we're grateful for the opportunity to meet, work, and play on this territory as settlers. As today's session is focused on education, we also recognize the alarming education and employment gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in Canada. We extend solidarity with Indigenous communities in calls to the federal government to eliminate discrepancies in education funding for First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children on and off reserves, and to ensure education legislations are developed with full participation and informed consent of Indigenous communities. So like I hinted before, our conversation today will focus on understanding existing challenges in Ontario's education system, the proposed changes by the Government of Ontario, and what that could mean for marginalized students, and what does it all mean for the future of it in terms of education for our children. So we have an amazing set of panelists today as our guests for our session. We have Dr. Tope Adefarakan, Neethan Shan, and Jeewan Chanicka. And before we begin, just a quick bio. And again, like always, I don't do justice to the experience and the accomplishments of our speakers in their short bio. So we will be posting them in the comment section after the session. But just a quick bio. Dr. Tope Adefarakan is the proud mother of a young boy. As a Peel parent, she's a member of Advocacy Peel, a coalition of Black parents and multiracial allies advocating for a school system free of anti-Black racism and other forms of discrimination. Dr. Adefarakan expertise is in the areas of equity and anti-Black racism, anti-oppression, and African Indigenous studies, where she has over 15 years of experience teaching sociology, education, women's studies, and equity studies. She holds a PhD from the Collaborative Doctoral Program in the Department of Sociology and Equity Studies in Education and the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Her book titled The Souls of Yoruba Folk, Indigeneity, Race, and Critical Spiritual Literacy in the African Diaspora was published by the Peter Lang Inc. As part of Black Studies and Critical Thinking, Spirituality, and Indigenous Thought Studies series. Neethan Shan is the Executive Director of the Urban Alliance on Race Relations. He is a former City of Toronto Councillor and the Toronto District School Board Trustee for Scarborough Rouge River. From 2006 to 2010, he also served as a York Region District School Board Trustee. He has served as a math and science teacher, a college professor, and is a former Executive Director of Cantide and the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians. Good to have you back, Neethan. Neethan's extensive involvement in the social service sector also includes work with Parent Action on Drugs, Malvern Community Coalition, Community Use of Schools Council, and Scarborough Youth Task Force, just to name a few. Neethan has a distinguished human rights advocacy record, receiving many awards, including the Race Relations Award from the Urban Alliance on Race Relations and the Vital People Award from the Toronto Community Foundation. As a Toronto City Councillor, Neethan was Toronto's Youth Equity Champion and Newcomer Advocate. Jeewan Chanicka is currently the CEO Superintendent of a growing international American school system based in Dubai. He is the former Superintendent of Equity, Anti-Racism, and Anti-Oppression, and Superintendent of Schools in Canada's largest school board, the Toronto District School Board. Jeewan's professional past includes his work as an education officer at the Ministry of Education in Ontario in the Inclusive Education Branch, and prior to that, a principal and teacher in York Region District School Board. He has a BA in Conflict Resolution and Culturally Appropriate Forms of Mediation, and his master's degree in Education. He has been a speaker across North America and Europe, and a community organizer and activist for over 25 years on a variety of issues around equity, inclusion, anti-oppression, youth parent engagement, anti-Indigenous, anti-Black racism, and racism. Jeewan's awards include the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee, a Human Rights Award from National Council of Canadian Muslims, and the Mary Samuels Education Leadership Award in November 2017 from Harmony Movement. So as you can see, we have an amazing set of panelists, and we are really hoping to have a really great discussion and talk about some critical issues in our education system. So again, if you're tuning in for the first time, our anti-hate conversation series are part of our anti-hate community leaders group. We air every Tuesday at 4 p.m. on our Facebook Live, and we'll also be uploading the session on YouTube for those individuals that don't have access to Facebook. We do have a set of questions that we will be asking the panelists, but if there are any burning questions that anybody has in the audience, you can type them in the Facebook comments. We do have somebody monitoring those comments, and if we have some time, we can address some of those questions. So let's get right into it. So our first question, so we know that there are a lot of systemic barriers and challenges in the Ontario education system, especially for racialized and Indigenous communities. So let's talk about some of the critical areas that we need to work on for improving the education system and in order to make a difference for marginalized students. And how do we accomplish this? So Dr. Tope, do you want to take on that first question?
Sure, thank you for that. So I also wanted to say in terms of another aspect of the important work that I do with respect to equity is that I'm also the board co-chair and have been for almost a decade at Women at the Center, which is also known as the Women's Center for Social Justice. And they do really excellent work with respect to gender-based violence across sectors. And I just think it's important to mention that as well. Given that the people that we're talking about, and all of them, well, a number of them anyways, have gender identities. So I guess one of the things, where we are at now, and this is always, I mean, this is my lived experience, where we are at now is we're in a state of emergency, and we have been for quite some time when it comes to what it means to be Black, what it means to be of African descent, where Black children essentially are not seen as children, right, in the school system, and the humanity of Black children is also denied in other sectors as well, child welfare being one. And recently, in June, early June, the Toronto Board of Health unanimously voted to recognize anti-Black racism as a public health crisis. And also did Mayor Crombie as well moved a motion to have it be recognized. And so, you know, for us at Peel Advocacy, the question then becomes, well, what's the crisis response? What does the response need to be? And what does it need to look like when it comes to specifically formal education? So first and foremost, the Education Act, Section 169, talks about providing the school boards a healthy and inclusive climate with respect to children. But the language is quite neutral when it comes to race and racism, in the sense that it doesn't mention and it doesn't name, saying criminal justice, law enforcement. You have a situation where there is a crisis and there is a state of emergency with respect to the experiences of people who are of African descent or who are Black, and people who are Indigenous. And so within the Education Act, one of the things that we're looking for at Peel Advocacy is to have the Act recognize and name anti-Black racism and also name anti-Indigenous racism, so that we can then use, so that it's embedded in legislation, and that we can then move forward with respect to accountability measures when children's rights are violated by virtue of their identity. So that's one piece. I think one of the things also that's important with respect to education is the kinds of powers that, you know, boards have. So boards have these really sweeping absolute powers in terms of making decisions around the safety and well-being of Black children, and of children that come from other marginalized communities. But we've seen, especially within the latest board that has actually come under the microscope has been the Peel District School Board. Nothing, I wouldn't say that there's anything specific or unique about Peel in the sense of the crisis of anti-Black racism, because prior to that it was, you know, York, and prior to that it was Toronto, and so we know that it's a provincial, and if you know, and quite honestly a national issue, right? With respect to anti-Black race, and I would even say international issue. So I think one of the things that's really important when we're talking about the kinds of powers that trustees have, and what the trustees have proved, with the exception of two at Peel District School Board, is that they have been complicit in the harm of Black children. They have participated in the harm and the human rights violations of Black children. So I think we need to really also be taking a look at, you know, what are the credentials and qualifications in terms of what trustees, who trustees are, and the work that they need to be doing, because they're not educators, right? They don't necessarily have, for the most part, they don't have an equity lens or don't use an equity lens in making these decisions. So I think we need to take a really good look at unpacking that and addressing, and using that lens when we are voting people that want to do this civic duty into office, that they need to have these kinds of credentials, and they need to be able to use these lenses so that they can do what the Education Act is claiming to do right now, which is, and it's not doing a very good job, which is providing that really safe school climate. And it's not happening for Black children right now. So that's one of the things that is really fundamentally important. And I think also the next thing is that police need to be defunded. We're hearing a lot about policing, and at Advocacy Peel, we agree that the police need to be defunded. The money and the resources that goes into policing can be redirected to other community efforts and other community resources that will actually provide a safe climate and a safe livelihood for people that are most marginalized. And that includes the SRO program. It's not limited to that, but it does include the SRO program, which in Peel, somewhere of about, I think there's a $9 million contract between the Peel Police Services and the District School Board, somewhere about of that. And that kind of money can be redirected, for example, to resourcing Afrocentric schools, right? A place and space where Black children, where children of African descent can learn about their identities, can learn about their histories, their culture, and who they are, in a way that doesn't take away from them, in a way that they don't become criminalized. And in a way that's support and just surviving right now. And so I'll leave it there for now, and I guess I'll jump in and talk a little bit more about some of the other things. But I'll leave it there for now.
Great, thank you. So those are really great points, and definitely agree about the state of emergency. You mentioned the issues around trustees, that schools are not generally safe places for Black students. Jeewan, do you have anything else to add in terms of critical areas that need improvement?
Thanks. So I think I would start by saying that schools have not been successful since their inception in serving Black, Indigenous, racialized, and marginalized kids ever. There's no system anywhere that we can find or point to that has systemically been able to address these gaps. And so every year, we keep seeing for 30, 40, 50 years, the exact same patterns reproducing. I think the other thing is that there is no shortage of research that we can turn to or that we can point to that tells us how to address this. So so if we're saying that there's no absence of research, and we can point to tons of research that's saying here are the ways to address this so that Black children can be successful, Indigenous kids can be successful, children with special needs, children coming out of poverty, 2S LGBT identifying children, like we can go down this list. Until now, I mean, it's 2020 and we're still having the conversation, for example, about girls going into STEM. And why is it girls can't see themselves or they're not well represented? And then the more layered their identity is, so girls is one thing, but if you're a Black girl, it's a different thing. If you're a Black girl who's a lesbian, it's a different thing. If you're a Black girl who's a lesbian and a Muslim and have a disability, then you just, that child's going to face compounding barriers that's going to affect them. So then the thing that we need to be asking ourselves is, if we have research that tells us what to do, if we truly believe that education can level the playing field, why is it that we have not yet done anything differently? And then what are the expectations and the accountability measures that are tied to districts that actually close gaps? In my experience, as of up to now, districts are not held accountable by the Ministry of Education for actually closing the gaps. There's no review process where the Ministry of Education sits with a board and says, show me how you have closed the gaps, and then accountability measures have been placed against that board to be able to say, you need to actually change this. How are you building this? So, I mean, recently we've heard some great announcements. Okay, there's a commitment to ending streaming. That's fine. It's a wonderful announcement, but you know, there are schools in TDSB, for example, where this work has been going on for a few years now. It's more than just saying you're not going to do it anymore. So you could remove the title, but then streaming is just going to keep happening, because if we talk about streaming as just applied and academic, of course you're going to see it as a high school thing. But if you understand that streaming is a process whereby children who of varying identities are pushed out of the school system, you understand that that process begins from kindergarten. It happens all the way through the special education process. It happens all the way through the transition process from grade 7 and 8 into grade 9. It happens through which courses kids are going into. It happens through the discipline processes that happens, right? Suspensions, expulsions, and then it's then compounded by how many credits and who gets to graduate. So I would say, you know, those are things that we have to really think about in terms of what I think the promise of this time is, to the title of this session, is that there's a lot more awareness of communities, of what they need to do to be able to speak on behalf of their children. And I think what I'm seeing is that communities are no longer willing to back down. And I think that as an educator, as somebody who's complicit as a senior leader in education, that, you know, we have to welcome that, because we have not been successful. And so we need community to help us so we can fix this. And I think that's the opportunity that we have right now in this moment.
Great. Thank you, Jeewan. And we'll address that a little bit more in the second question. But I just wanted to go to Neethan and see if he wants to add anything to that first question.
Yeah, I think we have to differentiate education from education system. Education is always good. Education system cannot be assumed to be good. I think that's what the problem is. I think people who work in the education system wake up in the morning and think that they're already good because they work in the system. They're helping somebody, they're educating somebody. And this self-fulfilling prophecy of people in the education system, including teachers, I used to be a teacher as well, have to change. Education can be a greatest equalizer only if it's done right. Otherwise, it'll be the greatest enforcer of inequities. And that's what's happening in our system. And, you know, what has happened to us as racialized communities is that we've been distracted often by, you know, giving us a certain policy item here, policy item there, or a particular incident happened and we mobilize, which is great. But when all these things happen, things are not changing because these are all bits and pieces of the system. The entire system still continues to replicate inequities. So for example, when I was a high school student 2 decades ago, we talked about curriculum not being reflective, and we're still talking about curriculum not being reflective of the diversity, and we'll still be talking about it. But the ministry that is responsible for doing this is okay to fire a director, which is important. The director was awful in Peel region. But where's the responsibility of the ministry, which runs the trustees? I know trustees have been really problematic. They don't have an equity analysis in many of these boards, but they are limited in their capacity to change. I think the flawed model of trying to point different fingers at different places has kind of confused the general public around a lot of the things that are happening. And then the advantage has been taken by people who want to reproduce these systemic inequities. The curriculum has not been changed. Employment hasn't been changed in terms of racialized, particularly Black educators being promoted and to senior level. Even when they get to senior level, what kind of support is being provided for them to speak up and change things around? So I think the entire system needs to be transformed if we were to talk about this. And if we cannot start to question ourselves as educators or people involved in the education system as perpetrators of racism, not reflect on how we are actually complicit in systemic racism, we cannot change this. So I think that's why I think we have to have a serious conversation with teachers unions, for example, to say, if we talk about education system being a system of systemic racism, who works predominantly in this system? The director is there, trustee is there, but a lot of these things happen in schools as well, in classrooms. So who are those people in classroom that are doing this reinforcement of systemic inequities? So a kind of a challenge for us is that what we consider traditionally progressive spaces are so reluctant to acknowledge racism and to address it, particularly anti-Black racism. What is happening today is not a result of system trying to change. It was because of parents organizing. The systems that were refusing to use anything other than diversity and inclusion 2 years ago are now able to say anti-Black racism and ask for provincial government to intervene. That didn't happen because of their willingness. It happened because parents organized, particularly Black parents organized in Peel region. And I think that's where we have to keep pushing the system to transform one step at a time. But incrementalism is not good enough anymore. It's not about one thing here, one thing there, because then we would leave this fight to our next generation to continue the next fight. We have to say enough is enough. Let's transform the entire system to make it work for the most marginalized. Let's start from there. If it works for a Black, young, marginalized person with facing multiple barriers from one, then it'll work for everybody else. So why don't we target our most systemic approach to start to address the needs and the challenges and the barriers faced by a young person from the Black community or Indigenous community, and then everybody else will feel the benefits of it. But if we just look at general solutions, people will still be finding that they're left out of the situation.
Thank you, Neethan. So Jeewan and Neethan, both of you touched on this a little bit in terms of the organizing of parents around some of the critical issues. So what does that look like? What is the role of students, parents, and advocacy group in getting them involved in these process of improvements? And also, if you can touch on what is the role of non-Black racialized parents? Because we see that there's organizing by Black parents, but where are the South Asian parents and the Asian parents? And where does the solidarity need to come in? Maybe Jeewan can go first in this one.
I'm happy to take that, but I'm also mindful that Dr. Tope is doing that work right now, and I think would probably bring better expertise to it than in this moment. So I don't know if you'd like to take it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for that, Jeewan. And so, yes, just to, this is the work that is, that is happening right now in Peel. Peel has been under the spotlight for some months now. And Peel Advocacy has been one of the groups that have been at the forefront of holding the school board to account. And as was said, we're a coalition of Black parents and multiracial allies who came together by virtue of the experiences that Black children were having. Sometimes it was, our own children, and sometimes it was just hearing about, people within the community and their struggles and challenges in terms of the experiences that are happening, and the gross or egregious racism, and not having a feasible, not being satisfied with the responses that we're being given. And so one of the important things, and Peel Advocacy is an excellent example of that, is building community. Guaranteed, there are always people that are fighting, speaking truth to power, that are refusing to accept the status quo. So being able to find and look for people that are challenging the system, that are refusing to accept this, education as it happens, and as it's currently being delivered, especially when it comes to Black students and Black children, is really fundamentally important. And so, Peel Advocacy has, an organization that has been in place for 4 years, that has been challenging and taking to account the school board in its flagrant anti-Black racism. And as I had said before, there were but 2 trustees, who have been fighting for 6 years, and us in the parenting community have been challenging the board, going to delegations, writing letters, writing petitions, mobilizing and organizing, protesting, having rallies, to bring to attention the fact that we would not accept the way that our children have been treated. And both Neethan and Jeewan have talked about some of the things that our children have experienced, which is the detentions, the suspensions, the expulsions. But then there's those things that happen in the school and the schooling system, but then there's the microaggressions too, the criminalization and dehumanizing of children. And then and challenged the board, the police was called on us parents, right? And so it's about, I think, finding and building community, and a refusal to accept the status quo, because our children, within the Black community, the ethos of wealth is our children. It's not in money so much as it is in our children as our future. And I just wanted to mentally important, but I think also when we're doing the work here at Peel Advocacy, again, it's Black parents, but there's also multiracial allies that are standing with us, that are also speaking truth to power, that are also acknowledging and understanding their privilege, and understanding and learning about anti-Black racism and what that means, and what that, to a certain extent, I would say, on a international scale as well, in terms of, the heinous lynching of George Floyd, right? And what happened to him, in terms of the world, breaking out in protests, because it was something that was caught on video. But I think one of the things that's really important to remember is that this is something that we've been experiencing as a community of people of African descent for a very, very long time. And we've been speaking about it and fighting against it for a very, very long time. And while it's very good, right? It's a pivotal moment, I would say, that people are awakening to it now. It's also, I would say, a shame that it took seeing a video, right, of a man being lynched, a Black man being lynched, for us to be believed. And that it took people who are not Black going out into the streets and declaring Black Lives Matter, when we've been doing it for such a long time. And so what's really important is that kind of going out into the streets and those declarations that's the beginning. It doesn't end there. So what are some other ways that you can show your allyship and that you can show support as well, outside in the school system, in the criminal justice system? And it's really showing support of groups such as Advocacy Peel, right? So when we are, when we have demands such as the removal of the school resource program, the removal of police officers from schools, when we be defunded, that's how you can show your support. You can show your support through voting, you can show your support through standing with us, you can show your support through declarations of your privilege, and standing in support of what it is that we need to ensure that our children go to school and that they come back alive and that they come back safe. So those are some examples of how we can show our, their support and stand with us. The work that we're doing at Advocacy Peel right now, because we are at a moment where a supervisor has been appointed and to date is doing great work in terms of, you know, the historical appointment of a Black woman as the director, but it doesn't mean that the work stops, right? It continues here because, you know, I think about the appointment of, you know, being at this moment where there are 3 Black women right now that are in positions of leadership that are directing school boards, you know, in Ottawa, at Toronto, and here in Peel. And I think about how, though, that is a very tricky space to be. And this is not to take away from clearly the very clear credentials and qualifications that these women have, but when are we brought in and how are we brought in to do work when systems are, you know, in disarray, right? And sometimes what happens, and it happened, you know, Obama, Trump right now is a result of what of the backlash, the white rage, right? Of having a Black man in the highest political office, some would say in the world, for 8 years, where now you have this real racist white supremacist backlash because of, you know, Black people in positions of power. So my point here is that we have to keep our eyes on, and it has to be sustained support. It can't be something where people are simply going into the streets and declaring Black Lives Matter and not standing with the groups, especially the parent groups and other groups that are at the forefront of making demands in terms of what systemic change needs to look like. It has to be sustained. It has to continue, and it has to be ongoing, because we don't want situations where people in the Black people that are in positions of leadership are the ones that are, even though they're inheriting this, it's all our responsibility to do that work of eliminating oppression, eliminating racism, and eliminating inequities. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the, so those are some examples of what people who are not, you know, Black, but are racialized, or people who are white can do in terms of providing support. And I would also say that our Twitter handle for Peel Advocacy, pay attention to this Twitter handle, is Black Lives Matter Peel Advocacy. We also have a Facebook page. On August 3rd, there is a rally for Black students that is being organized by Vaughan African Canadian Association, as well as Parents of Black Children, some other organizations that are in Vaughan and that are at the forefront again of that have demands with respect to what rectifying and eliminating anti-Black racism looks like. So please visit their websites. Mm-hmm. And it's about standing in support of these community organizations.
Thank you, Dr. Tope. So Neethan, do you want to just add quickly, and then I'll move on to the next question?
Yeah, I think there's 2 types of, broadly speaking, 2 types of avenues. One is the parent involvement structures that the school boards have created. They're very superficial and tokenistic. You know, parent council meetings talk more about pizza than race relations. And when the real issues are not being addressed, and when they're being managed by administrators and people in power, that structures don't work. And when race relations advisory committees are being formed by school boards, they're kept as a separate standalone committee that comes to complain about race relations, but they're not given real power to change policy, or they're not being sought advice on things. And when you structure these things in a way to structure to fail, and then you say that those committees are ineffective and you change them, and it keeps going in cycles. You have race relations committees, they get removed and they get brought back in, and the system made up of particularly people who believe in white supremacy in positions of power, including the education system, tend to drag these times along. Right now, be very wary that people will say certain things to buy time and drag this movement to kind of slow down. They're hoping that it will slow down at some point, then they can go back to their usual business as it is. So it's very important for racialized folks who are watching this, who are non-Black and non-Indigenous, to say, this is a time we can all galvanize and come together and put full strength behind as allies, not take up the space, but be able to put that political pressure. When you talk about defunding the police to support community resources, we talk about Scarborough, which has heavy racialized communities, and none of the councillors voted even to defund it by 10%. And that talks to the fact that a lot of the racialized folks, non-Black, non-Indigenous racialized folks, silence is being taken as an advantage by political people who are in power to not act on it. And it's very, very important that we see the moment in time. I always say, the many rights that we have seen, that we enjoy today in North America have been the hard work of civil rights movement and other activism around against racism by the Black community and Black leaders and Black civic leaders. So it's important for us to not be complacent and not be caught up in this model minority or trying to seek power and privilege by trying to appease to the white powers, because they're not going to give any form of rights or representation or anything to any racialized community. So it's important for us to galvanize together. So parent movements at this point of time have been very critical. And if all of our racialized parents can think through this and stand in solidarity at this moment, it'll be hard to ignore this. Otherwise, what I feel is that the divide and rule will start to happen. And they're going to try to play these games again, which happened during colonial time, which continues to happen today, as to pit one community against each other. And as we saw, what happened in Peel region can be replicated province-wide, nationally, and internationally if need be, as long as we all understand the historic disadvantage on the Black community is simply uncomparable to many of our experiences as newcomers and immigrants. Not about trying to figure out who is doing what. The disadvantages of or the kind of historic oppression of slavery and colonialism and the continuous systemic exclusion from employment and education is comparable. I mean, the Indigenous community has gone through a genocide here, but relative to a lot of our places, we cannot use the same stories. It's like white people telling me, white people who came from Europe saying when they came here, they came with nothing too. Those type of comparison needs to go, and we need to find a way to be in real solidarity as parents. I think we are also looking at our racialized trustees as well, non-Black racialized trustees. This is your time to stand up. If you're not standing up, you don't represent me. The brown trustees there, if you're being quiet about anti-Black racism, you don't represent me, because you have gone in to say that you would be taking up equity as a champion. And so it's not just about me, it's about all equity seeking groups, particularly people who have serious barriers that have been created. So I feel like it's an opportunity, but at the same time, I'm very cautious that the phase 2 of this, if you may, will be a serious attempt to divide and conquer by structures who want to keep white supremacy at the center of education system. And we need to be very careful in watching this closely.
Thank you, Neethan. Being mindful of time, I do want to bring something that's really critical at this time and talk a little bit about Bill 197 that's recently been introduced by the government of Ontario. So as a former trustee, Neethan, so I'll ask you this first, and then Jeewan, if you want to jump in as a superintendent and CEO. How do you feel about the government's push to make directors of education not educators? So if you want to take a few minutes to answer that, Neethan.
Well, let me start with saying that appointing or hiring the director of education for the school board is one of the most important decisions trustees make. They're not that powerful as many people think they are, but getting the senior most director is the very, very important role. And whether we have non-educator or educators, I don't think the trustees right now get equity enough to be hiring the right person. So they need to be trained, They need to have an equity training before they go into this hiring. The search firms they hire are very much embedded in Eurocentrism, and they're looking for people within their networks. And if these search processes are very subjective and do not often enable folks to be from racialized communities to come forward, and racialized educators who are on senior level who speak up against racism may be given, thank you for saying so, but often are not the ones chosen to be promoted and so on. So let me say the current process is not working well enough before we criticize what the government is going to come to do. So I'm not a big fan of what is being done right now, but let me also say, the government is trying to coach this as a way to bring diversity, which I feel is not the case. Because if the government was interested in diversity, let's start with diversifying the curriculum. Let's have a serious employment equity legislation. Let's have measurements about who's getting promoted and so on. Why don't you do those things before you talk about? Because if the pipeline of leadership was coming straight from teachers, there are a lot of amazing educators from racialized communities who could become amazing directors as well. I think this is an agenda to bring privatization. If you want to take care of you have deputy directors, assistant directors who can take care of finance and other roles, and their roles are being taken care of. But as a head of education should have field experience, and field experience dealing with all these issues as well. So I feel strongly that this is the agenda to bring bankers or political friends and so on, instead of taking away this decision. I could see, if this passes, I could see a couple of months down the road, the decision to appoint the director would be taken away from the trustees and then be something that the province want to do. And then what you see is kind of a driving of a market-driven, private sector-based education system, which is going to be even harder for us to address as well when that comes into. So I'm very wary of this. Instead of thinking about the merit of this conversation, let's think about the agenda behind this conversation. Because there could be. I will be the first one to agree. There is potentially amazing directors of education who could come from non-education background, but this is not about whether that is possible or not. This is about why is it being done right now? What is the agenda behind this? What's the track record of the government that is bringing this agenda on for? And be very careful not to take away the autonomy of educators. I always feel, Samia, you are in not-for-profit sector. When we have an executive director in a not-for-profit sector who came from field work, they're often much better understanding of what is needed on the ground. And same way in education, if we have the field experience, if we have been going through what it takes to run a classroom, what it takes to deal with students of diverse background and support and nurture their learning, you're going to be a better director than somebody who comes from a banking or a corporate efficiency-driven, cost-cutting type of agenda.
Thank you. Jeewan, do you want to add to that? And then we'll go to Dr. Tope for the last question.
So I think as somebody in the most senior role right now, I would say that my education experience is what I draw on. And I think if it is, we're thinking about how do we actually change outcomes for the most marginalized students, Indigenous, Black, racialized children, kids coming out of poverty, kids who are identified with special needs, to us LGBT children. You really need an educator who understands the nuances of education in order to be able to go into it in a way that that understands it. And I think for the most part, what I've heard from communities, it's not, the communities don't want racialized people just because their skin is a different color. They want racialized folks, they want Black folks, they want Indigenous folks, and anybody who gets here with anti-racist backgrounds. That is what they're asking for. So the issue is more than just diversity. What they're looking for are anti-racist educational leaders who can get in there and be able to understand that education has created these gaps. It's not broken, it was created this way. So what does education transformation need to look like? And how do we center the voices of the most marginalized people? And what does this begin to look like when we stop treating communities of marginalized children as being the problem and start bringing them to the table as part of the solution? And I think that has been largely lacking and missing. And I think that, you know, without having an education background, it's very, yes, like Neethan said, there may be opportunities that you might get the odd good person who will get in there. But when you have to make decisions that has to look at really dismantling structures and educations and transforming them, I would say that if somebody does not have that as their background, they're going to be at a huge disadvantage. And what I would worry about is if you look to the South, for example, where that requirement does not exist. So CEOs and superintendents, which in American language is equal to directors in Ontario, you don't have to be an educator. And if we look at what's happening there, streaming is exactly what ends up happening. Charter schools, all those pieces. And I think it will actually lead to the exact opposite of what this government has now said that they're dedicated towards, which is ending streaming. I think that what will end up happening is it will lead to streaming, whether or not we have applied and academic. But I think what will happen is streaming, and it will disproportionately affect Indigenous Black children and all marginalized children who have been marginalized since the beginning of time. So I think we really need to really think about that. And I mean, I saw there's a petition going around, I believe, and somebody was saying to me that within, I think this, Neethan, you're involved in it, but within a day and a half, they've had 30,000 signatures of people saying that, you know, we disagree with this. So I think that that's something for the government to really consider.
Samia, just before you go,
Yeah.
this quick point that it is being discussed as part of an omnibus bill couched into a thing, such an important decision is also very problematic as well.
Yeah, so I know that people have mentioned that that's the way that it's hidden into a COVID relief type of bill is really concerning. And a lot of people, if it wasn't brought up by advocates and educators, and people wouldn't even have noticed that that was in there. So just last, no, we're out of time. So, yep.
One last thing, sorry, and it's this. It's something that I've found very interesting, and I've noticed that time after time, is that somehow the other decisions that are made for education, everyone seems to think that they're an expert in education because they went to school. So when it comes to healthcare, we'll go to doctors. When it comes to you know, business, we'll go to, you know, CEOs and banking, you know, professionals, finance professionals. But when it comes to education, people who actually have scholarship in education are not the ones who are being consulted. And it really makes me wonder why that is. Why is it that people who are not, you know, scholars or scholar practitioners who have track records in closing gaps, why they are not the ones who are being consulted to actually address this? I've seen so much conversation in the last week since this thing, I guess, really hit the fan. And there's so many people who just feel like they can have an opinion, and it's fine, have your opinion, but just because you went to school does not make you an education expert. And you know, so I just want to say that.
Thank you, Jeewan. So just I'll give the final words to Dr. Tope. So if you want to just talk a little bit about where, so with all these changes or these proposed changes about de-streaming, banning suspensions for elementary students under grade 3, and now the Bill 197, where do you think the education system is heading in the right direction? And if it's not, what do we need to do? Because you did mention it's a state of an emergency. What is our next step right now?
So thank you for that. Yeah, so you know, this is a bit of a tricky question. So I think it's a step in the right direction, if you can call it that, in terms of, you know, streaming for grade 9 and from JK to grade 3, but it doesn't push far enough. It simply is not enough, and many in our community actually see it as crumbs, to be honest, because when we're talking about the way that Black children are not, you know, seen as children, right? And they're put on these different pathways of confinement. prison being one of them, but there are a number of other forms of confinement that happen, right? So there's child welfare, there's trafficking, there's a number of different forms of confinement that happen. And it's so problematic because suddenly it works with, I would say it's working with this assumption that suddenly, you know, Black children that are grade 4 and up have their humanity now, right? Or suddenly Black students that, you know, from grade 10 and up suddenly don't experience all of the, you know, the bounds of research that is talked about, that is, you know, evidence the fact that anti-Black racism happens throughout, right? That it simply is not enough, and it needs to recognize that there's a spectrum of oppression that happens. And so the work that is happening right now, and it's happening, you know, it's being pushed forward by parent group and advocacy groups, and we need to be at those tables. We need to be at those tables holding, as Jeewan said and as Neethan said, holding educators to account, holding the system to account, and saying, what are the changes that need to happen? So it simply isn't enough. And again, if people, in terms of the international or the worldwide declaration that Black Lives Matter, if people who are not Black, who are not of African descent, and who are white, who are racialized and who are white, truly believe in that, then they need to stand in solidarity with the communities that are at the forefront, the Black community that is at the forefront of saying what we need to see happen in order to truly achieve equity and achieve safe spaces for our children to be able to thrive and be truly participating members within our world.
Thank you so much. So I'm afraid we're out of time. We're actually a little bit over time, but I didn't want to cut anybody off because of the critical conversation that we were having. And I hope the people that are watching take this in as a learning moment. If you haven't already, and start to get involved, contact, you know, your parent advocacy groups and see what needs to be done. And I'm sure the 3 panelists here, if anybody wants to get involved with the work that they're doing, would be more than happy to connect. So again, thank you for joining us, Dr. Tope, Jeewan, Chanicka, and Neethan. And we'll be back next week. Next week, our session will be on misogyny and sexism within racialized communities and between communities, and the role that white supremacy may play in misogyny and sexism. So thank you, and we'll be back next week and see you then. Take care.